Brian, a combat veteran, believed he had finally found peace on his new farm, the one place he hoped to heal the wounds of war. His only companion, Thor, a majestic German shepherd, was the picture of health and loyalty. But that peace was suddenly shattered. Just hours after drinking from a seemingly peaceful creek, Thor suddenly collapsed, his powerful body seized by violent convulsions. This was no ordinary sickness. As Brian desperately held his only companion in his arms, a horrifying truth dawned on him. This was not an accident. It was a warning. The land he thought was a sanctuary was actually a trap, and some faceless enemy had just struck at the one thing he held most dear. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The old Ford pickup groaned as it made the final turn off the county highway onto a gravel road. Dust, the color of rust and gold, billowed up behind it, a temporary cloud against the vast, impossibly blue Nebraska sky. Inside the cab, Brian kept a steady hand on the wheel, his knuckles white. He drove slowly, not just because the truck was old and the suspension was shot, but because he was trying to commit every detail to memory. This was it, the end of one road and the beginning of another. He glanced at the passenger seat. Sprawled across it, with his massive head resting comfortably on Brian's thigh, was Thor. A 4-year-old German shepherd, Thor was a magnificent animal. His coat was a thick, rich sable, a blend of deep grays and silvers that faded to a creamy white on his chest and legs. His ears were perpetually alert, two perfect triangles that swiveled to catch every sound the wind carried across the cornfields. But it was his eyes, the color of dark amber, that held a startling intelligence and an unwavering loyalty. They were fixed on Brian now, watching, waiting. Brian reached over and scratched behind one of Thor's ears. "Well, buddy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is it, home." The word felt foreign on his tongue. Home had been a series of tents, barracks, and temporary outposts for more years than he cared to count. This, 120 acres of Nebraskan farmland with a rickety farmhouse and a leaning barn, was something else entirely. It was a chance. As he pulled up to the house, the truck's engine sputtered and died with a grateful sigh. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of wind through the endless rows of late-season corn that bordered the property. It was a soft, whispering sound, a world away from the sharp, percussive echoes that still haunted the edges of his sleep. This was the silence he had been chasing for 2 years, ever since he'd traded his army fatigues for civilian life. Brian stepped out of the truck, his worn work boots crunching on the gravel. He was a tall man, lean but with the wiry strength of someone whose muscles were accustomed to hardship. His brown hair was cut short, practical, with premature threads of silver glinting at his temples. A thick, neatly trimmed beard covered a jaw that was perpetually tight, but it couldn't hide the kindness in his eyes or the weary lines etched around them. He wore a simple uniform of his own design, a plaid shirt of navy, gray, and faded beige left unbuttoned over a plain gray t-shirt and jeans that had long ago lost their original dark blue color. Thor leapt gracefully from the truck, landing silently beside him. The dog immediately began a thorough investigation of the new territory, his nose to the ground, his powerful tail giving a few slow, inquisitive wags. Brian watched him, a rare, small smile touching his lips. He walked up to the porch of the 2-story farmhouse. The white paint was peeling, and one of the steps sagged, but it was solid. He sat down on the top step, the old wood groaning in protest, and pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket. He lit one, the familiar ritual a small point of stability in a world that felt brand new. The sun was warm on his face. He closed his eyes, just listening. The corn rustled. A bird called out from a distant oak tree. The silence he craved. After a few minutes, Thor finished his patrol and trotted up to the porch, settling down with a heavy sigh at Brian's feet. He rested his head on Brian's boot, his amber eyes closing contentedly. Brian looked down at the dog, the smoke from his cigarette curling up into the afternoon air. "It's gonna be different here, Thor," he said softly, the words meant only for the dog. No more waking up in a sweat. No more looking over my shoulder. Just this. Just quiet. He took a long drag from his cigarette. We can fix this place up. Get some chickens, maybe. A few head of cattle. Just work. Work hard enough that you're too tired to dream at night. That's the plan anyway. He reached down, his hand sinking into the thick fur of Thor's neck. The dog leaned into the touch, a low rumble of contentment in his chest. For Brian, this connection was everything. Thor had been with him through the difficult transition back to civilian life, a silent, steady presence when the world felt too loud and too fast. The dog had listened to more of his secrets, absorbed more of his pain than any human ever had. Thor was his confidant, his anchor, his one undisputed link to a life worth living. His quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of another engine, this one the sputtering cough of an old tractor or a truck in even worse shape than his own. A dusty blue pickup, at least 30 years old, rattled up the drive and came to a stop behind his Ford. An elderly man climbed out from behind the wheel. He was stooped with age, his skin weathered and leathery from a lifetime under the sun. He wore faded overalls and a stained baseball cap, and he walked with the slow, deliberate gait of a man whose joints ached. As he got closer, Brian could see a network of fine lines around his kind, tired eyes. "Figured that was you," the man said, his voice raspy. "Saw the dust. Hank Schrader, your neighbor to the east." He offered a calloused hand. Brian stood and shook it. "Brian, and this is Thor." Hank's eyes softened as he looked at the dog. Fine-looking shepherd. Not many folks moving in these days. Most are moving out. "Looking for some quiet," Brian said simply. Hank nodded, a sad understanding in his eyes. He leaned against the porch railing. "Well, you'll find quiet here. Maybe too much of it lately. It's good to have a new face, especially a young one." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Hank spoke again, his tone shifting. "I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news on your first day, son, but it's best you know what you're walking into." Brian took a final drag of his cigarette and flicked it into the dirt. "I'm listening. You see that land over there?" Hank gestured with his chin towards the horizon, past Brian's cornfields. In the distance, a sterile-looking chain-link fence topped with barbed wire shimmered in the heat. Beyond it, there were no crops, just barren-looking dirt and a few large metallic buildings. "That's AgriCorp, moved in about 5 years back. Said they were going to bring jobs, prosperity, a real shot in the arm for Promise Creek." He spat on the ground. "They brought something all right. Trouble." Hank's voice dropped, becoming a litany of grievances. He spoke of crop yields mysteriously dropping on farms that bordered the corporate land. He talked about livestock falling sick with strange ailments, of wells tasting funny. He mentioned families who had farmed this land for generations, forced to sell for pennies on the dollar to AgriCorp after a few bad seasons put them under. "They make you an offer," Hank said, his eyes hard. "You say no. A year later, you're bankrupt and begging them to take the land off your hands. Happened to the Millers, the Garcias. Good people. Gone now." A knot tightened in Brian's stomach. This wasn't the simple, peaceful life he had pictured. It sounded like a different kind of war. A slow, quiet siege. "The law?" Brian asked. Hank gave a short, bitter laugh. "What law? The sheriff says it's just bad luck. Hard times? AgriCorp's got deep pockets. Folks around here are too scared or too tired to fight." After a while, Hank straightened up, his back cracking audibly. "Well, I've said my piece. Welcome to the neighborhood, Brian. If you need anything, you know where to find me." He shuffled back to his truck and drove off, leaving another cloud of dust in his wake. Brian stood on the porch, the warmth of the sun no longer feeling so comforting. The silence he had craved now felt heavy, charged with the unspoken despair of his new neighbors. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thor stood up. He walked to the edge of the porch, every muscle in his body tensed. He wasn't looking at the farmhouse or the barn. His gaze was locked on the distant AgriCorp fence line. His ears were flat against his head, and a low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest. It wasn't a bark of excitement or a warning to a stray animal. It was a sound of profound distrust, of instinctual menace. Brian walked over and stood beside him, placing a hand on his back. The dog's muscles were rigid. Brian looked out at the corporate land, seeing only distant buildings and a fence. But Thor saw something else. His instincts, honed and pure, sensed a danger that was invisible to the human eye, a poison that had already begun to seep into the promise of this new life. The echoes of an old war had followed Brian here, and now it seemed he had just stumbled into a new one. The first week at the farm was a fragile truce with the ghosts of the past. Brian worked from sunrise to sunset, the physical labor a welcome anesthetic for his mind. He mended fences, cleared brush, and patched a section of the barn roof, his muscles aching with a clean, honest exhaustion he hadn't felt in years. In these moments, with the sun on his back and Thor shadowing his every move, the silence he had sought felt real, attainable. The grim warnings from his neighbor, Hank, seemed to belong to another world. On the afternoon of their 8th day, a blanket of heat settled over the valley. After hours of wrestling with a stubborn fence post, Brian decided they had earned a break. "Come on, Thor," he called out, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Let's walk the property line, see what we've really got." Thor, who had been patiently supervising from a patch of shade, was on his feet in an instant, his tail a blur of excitement. They set off together, walking along the edge of the cornfield. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and sun-baked cornstalks. A small creek, no more than a few feet wide, cut through the western edge of the property, its water running clear over a bed of smooth gray stones. It gurgled peacefully, a perfect picture of rural tranquility. Thor, panting heavily from the heat and the joy of the exploration, bounded down the shallow bank and began to lap eagerly at the cool water. Brian watched him, a sense of deep contentment settling over him. This was peace, simple, uncomplicated. He lit a cigarette and leaned against an old cottonwood tree, letting the quiet of the afternoon wash over him. Thor drank for a long time before trotting back up the bank, shaking his head and sending a spray of water droplets into the air. They returned to the farmhouse as the sun began its slow descent, leaving the sky bruised with shades of purple and orange. Brian felt a calm he hadn't known was possible. Maybe, he thought, this place could truly be a sanctuary. The calm shattered 2 hours later. It started subtly. Thor, who was usually shadowing Brian as he prepared a simple dinner, was lying listlessly on the cool linoleum floor. When Brian called his name, the dog's tail gave only a weak thump. His ears didn't perk up. A cold tendril of unease snaked its way up Brian's spine. He knelt beside the dog, his hand finding the fur on Thor's neck. It was damp with a clammy sweat. "What is it, buddy?" Brian murmured, his voice tight with concern. Thor whimpered, a low, pathetic sound that was utterly unlike him. Then his body tensed. A tremor ran through his powerful frame, and he began to drool, thick saliva pooling on the floor. The tremor became a shudder, then a violent convulsion. Thor's legs kicked out spastically, his back arching as his muscles seized in a terrifying, unseen grip. Panic, raw and absolute, seized Brian. It was a feeling he knew well, the adrenaline-fueled terror of a world falling apart, of watching something precious being ripped away from you with brutal force. He was on the floor, his hands on Thor, trying to soothe him, trying to hold him. But the dog was lost in the throes of the seizure, his amber eyes wide with a confusion and pain that tore through Brian like shrapnel. The seizure subsided, leaving Thor limp and gasping, his breathing shallow. Brian didn't hesitate. All the carefully constructed peace, all the hopes for a quiet life, evaporated. The soldier took over. There was only the mission: save Thor. He scooped the dog's heavy, unresponsive body into his arms, the dead weight a terrifying testament to how sick he was. He kicked the farmhouse door open and ran to his truck, gently placing Thor on the passenger seat. He jumped behind the wheel, his hands shaking so badly it took him 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the truck into gear, spraying gravel as he tore down the driveway. The 20-minute drive to the town of Promise Creek was a blur of terror. He pushed the old Ford faster than it had ever been meant to go, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Thor's chest, feeling the faint, fluttering heartbeat beneath his palm. "Hang on, buddy," he repeated over and over, his voice cracking. "Just hang on. You're going to be okay. Just hang on." He raced through the small, sleepy town, past the closed general store and the quiet town square, his headlights cutting through the deepening twilight. He skidded to a stop in front of the 1-story brick building with a simple sign out front: Promise Creek Veterinary Clinic. He was out of the truck before the engine was off, gathering Thor into his arms again and barging through the clinic door. The small waiting room was empty. A bell chimed somewhere in the back. "Hello?" he yelled, his voice strained with panic. "I need help. My dog." A woman appeared from a back room, wiping her hands on a towel. She was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent brown eyes that took in the scene in an instant. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical, no-nonsense ponytail, and she wore simple blue scrubs. Her expression was one of calm, focused competence. "On the table. Now," she said, her voice firm and clear, cutting through his panic. This was Dr. Jane Margolis. Her demeanor was direct and professional, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of compassion in her gaze as she looked at the suffering animal. Brian gently laid Thor on the cold steel examination table. Jane was already at work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She checked Thor's gums, listened to his heart and lungs with a stethoscope, and took his temperature. Another tremor started to run through Thor's body. "What happened?" Jane asked, her eyes never leaving the dog as she prepared an IV line. "I don't know," Brian stammered. "He was fine. We went for a walk this afternoon. He was fine. Then he just collapsed." He started shaking, convulsing. "Did he eat anything? Get into any trash? Any chemicals? Antifreeze? Rat poison?" The questions were rapid-fire, precise. "No, nothing. I'm with him all the time. He's always with me." Brian's mind raced, trying to replay every moment of the day. "We walked the property. He was running. It was hot. He was thirsty." The memory surfaced, sharp and sickening. "The creek. He drank from the creek on the west side of my land. He drank a lot of water." Jane's eyes flickered up to meet his for a second, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before she focused back on her work. She expertly inserted the IV catheter into Thor's leg and started a drip of fluids. She drew several vials of blood. "His heart rate is erratic, and he's showing severe neurological symptoms," she said, her voice steady. "This is poisoning. A bad one?" She worked for what felt like an eternity, administering injections to control the seizures and stabilize his heart. The violent convulsions subsided, leaving Thor terrifyingly still, his breathing a faint whisper. Jane moved to a small lab station in the corner of the room, analyzing the blood she had drawn. Brian could only stand there, his hands clenched into fists, feeling utterly helpless. He watched the woman who was the only thing standing between Thor and death, her focus absolute. Finally, she turned back to him, her expression grim. "This isn't any common poison I've ever seen," she said, her voice low and serious. "The metabolic profile is off the charts. The toxins are attacking his nervous system directly. This isn't something he would get into by accident in a barn. This is an industrial-grade chemical, something powerful, something nasty." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Someone poisoned your dog, Brian?" The words hit him not with a wave of sadness, but with the force of a physical blow. The frantic panic that had consumed him for the past hour receded, draining away to be replaced by something else, something cold and hard and terrifyingly familiar. It settled deep in his gut, a block of ice. He looked at Thor, his magnificent, loyal friend, lying limp and fighting for every breath on the cold steel table. He looked at the IV line, the machines, the sterile environment of a battle for survival. And he felt a profound shift inside him. The man who had come to Promise Creek seeking peace was gone. His last safe bunker had been breached. His anchor had been attacked. In that moment, the quiet farmer vanished, and the soldier he had tried so hard to bury stood at full attention. A cold, quiet, and methodical fury, the kind he had only ever felt on the battlefield, awakened in the silence of the veterinary clinic. And it demanded an answer. For 2 days, the farmhouse became an infirmary. Brian slept on a makeshift bed on the floor next to Thor, waking at the slightest change in the dog's breathing. He managed the IV drip Jane had sent home with them, his hands, once trained for the precise assembly of a rifle, now gentle and steady as he checked the line and administered the medications. The cold fury that had solidified inside him at the clinic did not dissipate. It simmered, a low-burning flame of purpose that fueled his meticulous care. He was a soldier on watch, and Thor was the entire world he had to protect. By the third morning, a significant change occurred. Thor lifted his head on his own. His amber eyes, though still clouded with exhaustion, were clearer, more focused. He managed to drink a bowl of water, his tail giving a few weak but definite thumps against the floor. A wave of profound relief washed over Brian, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. Later that afternoon, when Brian opened the door to let some fresh air in, Thor struggled to his feet. He was unsteady, his powerful legs trembling with weakness, but he was determined. He nudged Brian's hand with his nose, then looked meaningfully toward the open door. "You think you're ready for that, buddy?" Brian asked softly. "All right, easy does it." He helped support the dog's weight, and together they made their way slowly onto the porch. Thor stood there for a moment, breathing in the scent of the earth and sun. Brian expected him to lie down in a patch of shade, but instead, the dog's entire demeanor shifted. His nose twitched, sampling the air. His ears swiveled. Despite his physical frailty, a flicker of the old alertness returned. He took a shaky step, then another, pulling weakly but insistently in the direction of the western fields. Towards the creek. Brian's instinct was to stop him, to take him back inside to rest. But he paused. He had learned long ago to trust Thor's instincts. They were purer, more honest than any human's. The dog wasn't just looking for a place to relieve himself. There was a purpose in his movement. "Okay," Brian said, his voice low. "Show me." The journey was painstaking. Brian walked beside Thor, his hand hovering over the dog's back, ready to catch him if he stumbled. Thor moved with a single-minded focus, his nose low to the ground, ignoring the familiar scents of rabbits and quail. He was tracking something else, something his senses screamed was wrong. He led Brian straight back to the gurgling creek, to the exact spot where he had drunk the water that nearly killed him. But he didn't stop there. He pushed past the cottonwood tree and began to move upstream, his body trembling with the effort. He forced his way through a thicket of overgrown shrubs that separated Brian's property from the sterile chain-link fence of AgriCorp. The air here was different, heavier, with a faint, unpleasant tang to it, like bitter almonds and rust. Thor stopped abruptly. They were in a small, shadowed clearing, no more than 20 feet from the AgriCorp fence. The ground here was strangely barren. While the surrounding area was thick with weeds and wild grasses, this small patch was just damp, discolored earth. Thor began to whine, a high, anxious sound. He pawed weakly at a pile of dead leaves and loose soil, his eyes fixed on Brian, pleading. Brian knelt, the cold fury inside him sharpening into a razor-fine focus. He looked at the ground. It was too neat, too deliberate. He began to dig with his hands, pushing aside the damp leaves and soft dirt. His fingers brushed against something hard and cold. Metal. He cleared the remaining debris away. There it was. A heavy iron cap, painted a dull green to blend in with the foliage, covered the end of a wide-diameter pipe. It was a professional job designed to be hidden. He gripped the edge of the cap and pulled. It was heavy, but it lifted away, revealing the dark, circular mouth of the pipe. And from the bottom lip of that pipe, a clear, slightly viscous liquid was slowly, steadily dripping, pooling on the barren ground before seeping into the soil. It was this slow leak that was feeding the creek. This was the source. This was the weapon. A grim, triumphant smile touched Brian's lips. He had it, the proof, the smoking gun. He carefully replaced the cap and the covering of leaves, his movements precise and practiced, leaving no trace of his discovery. He helped the exhausted Thor back to the farmhouse, settling him on his bed with fresh water and a quiet word of praise that made the dog's tail thump. Then, grabbing an empty plastic water bottle from his truck, he went back. He collected a sample of the clear, oily liquid, sealing the cap tightly. The substance had almost no color, but it carried that faint, acrid chemical smell, the scent of a hidden poison. He drove to town, not with the frantic panic of his last trip, but with a cold, controlled sense of purpose. He felt the familiar adrenaline of a successful mission, of having located the enemy's position. He had the evidence. The fight was as good as over. He found Jane Margolis in her office, finishing up some paperwork. She looked up as he entered, her expression immediately shifting to one of concern when she saw him. "Brian, is Thor okay?" "He's better," Brian said, his voice tight with restrained energy. "He's a fighter. He led me right to it, Jane." He placed the plastic bottle on her desk. It stood there between them, a clear container holding a clear liquid, an invisible threat made visible. "It's a discharge pipe," he explained, the words coming out in a rush. "On the edge of my property, right by the AgriCorp fence, hidden. It's been leaking into the creek. This is what poisoned him. This is what's poisoning everything. We got them." Jane picked up the bottle, her brow furrowed. She looked from the bottle to Brian's triumphant face. He expected to see a shared sense of victory in her eyes, a confirmation that they had won. Instead, he saw a look of professional caution tinged with something that looked like pity. She set the bottle down gently. "Brian, where did you get this?" "I just told you. From the pipe." "Who was with you?" "Just Thor." "Did you wear gloves when you collected it?" she asked, her voice quiet. "No," he said, his confidence beginning to waver. "Why?" Jane sighed, leaning back in her chair. She looked at him, her eyes full of a weary intelligence. "Brian, I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with enough animal cruelty cases involving big farms to know the basics. What you have here," she gestured to the bottle, "is a bottle of water." Brian stared at her, uncomprehending. "It's poison." "I believe you," she said sincerely. "My tests on Thor's blood tell me you're right. But in a court of law, this bottle is worthless. Worse than worthless." She began to explain, her voice patient but firm, stripping away his victory layer by layer. She spoke of legal concepts he had never heard of. Chain of custody, the documented and unbroken trail of evidence. Admissibility, the strict rules for what a judge will even allow a jury to see. She explained that because he was an invested party, and because he had collected the sample himself with no official witness and no warrant, AgriCorp's lawyers would argue he could have put anything in that bottle. They would say he faked it. They would tear his credibility to shreds on the witness stand. "They won't have to prove their innocence," she concluded, her words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "They will just have to create reasonable doubt about your evidence. And with this, Brian, you've given them more than enough doubt to drive a truck through. It would be thrown out of court before a trial even started." He stared at the plastic bottle, the smoking gun, the proof. An hour ago, it had been a symbol of his victory. Now it was a monument to his failure. The adrenaline drained out of him, leaving a hollow, bitter emptiness. He had charged headfirst at the enemy, just as he had been trained to do, only to find the enemy wasn't a position to be overrun. It was a fortress of rules and laws he didn't understand, protected by weapons he couldn't see. The cold fury inside him was useless against this. He had tasted failure for the first time in this new war. And in that moment, looking at the useless bottle of poison, he understood. This fight wouldn't be won with courage alone. It would have to be won with intelligence, with patience, and with a strategy he had yet to conceive. The bitter lesson from Jane lingered in the air long after Brian left the clinic, the useless water bottle sitting on his passenger seat like a mockery of his efforts. He had spent his life fighting tangible threats, enemies you could see. This new enemy was a phantom, wrapped in layers of legal armor he couldn't penetrate with brute force. His first failure had taught him that a single soldier, no matter how determined, could not win this war alone. He needed an army. His first attempt at recruitment was his neighbor, Hank. He found the old man in his barn, mending a piece of machinery with gnarled, oil-stained hands. Brian laid out the whole story. Thor's poisoning, the creek, the hidden pipe. He spoke with a quiet, intense conviction, expecting shock, anger, anything but the profound weariness that settled over Hank's features. Hank listened patiently, nodding in all the right places. When Brian was finished, the old man sighed, a long, rattling sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I believe you, son," he said, his voice raspy. "Every word. We've all known something was wrong for years. We just didn't have a name for it." He wiped his hands on an old rag. "But you're asking me to fight. Brian, look at me. I'm 76 years old. My back is shot. This farm is drowning in debt. And I'm tired. I'm just so tired." His gaze drifted towards the open barn door, to the fields beyond. "They got us in a stranglehold. You make a fuss, your loan gets called in. Your supplier suddenly runs out of the seed you need. It's a quiet death. 1,000 little cuts. I'm just trying to hold on long enough to die on the land I was born on. I can't fight them. It's too late for me." He looked at Brian, his eyes filled with a sad apology. "You're a good man for trying, but be careful. They don't just take your farm, they take your fight too." Hank's words were a grim prophecy that played out over the next 2 days. Brian drove his truck from one small, struggling farm to the next, a modern-day Paul Revere trying to raise an alarm that no one wanted to hear. The reception was always the same. A flicker of interest in their eyes would quickly be extinguished by a wave of fear. He was met with polite but firm refusals, doors closed gently in his face, and mumbled excuses. They were trapped. They had children to feed, mortgages to pay. They had seen what happened to the families who left. They saw Brian not as a savior, but as a spark that could ignite a fire and burn down what little they had left. He was an outsider, a man with no family and nothing to lose, asking them to risk everything. The wall of fear was impenetrable. He returned to his own empty farmhouse each evening, feeling more isolated than he ever had in a war zone. At least there, he had a unit. Here, he was an army of one. On the third night, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, another set of headlights turned into his driveway. It wasn't Hank's rattling pickup. This was a newer, but still heavily battered truck. A young couple got out. The man was in his early 30s, with a weary face and the strong build of a farmer. The woman beside him was slighter, her dark hair pulled back in a braid, her eyes holding a mixture of apprehension and fierce determination. "Are you Brian?" the man asked. "I am." "My name is Mateo Garza," he said. "This is my wife, Elena. We have the farm 2 miles south of here. We heard you've been asking questions. About AgriCorp?" Brian nodded slowly, his posture guarded. "I have." It was Elena who spoke next, her voice clear and strong. "Our well went bad 6 months ago. Our youngest daughter got sick. The doctors said it was just a bug. And our corn yield this year, it's half of what it should be. We're about to lose everything." She looked directly at Brian, her chin held high. "We've got nothing left to lose. If you have a plan to fight those bastards, we want in." A crack appeared in the wall of Brian's isolation. It was a small alliance, born of desperation, but it was a start. He invited them in, and for the first time, the old farmhouse was filled with the quiet, determined murmur of a war council. Later that night, Brian drove to the clinic. He needed to tell Jane about his new allies, and more importantly, he needed to ask her a question that had been bothering him since his last visit. He found her in her office, surrounded by textbooks and files, a single lamp casting a warm glow in the otherwise dark building. Thor, who had come with him, padded over to Jane and rested his head on her lap, a gesture of gratitude that made her smile. Brian told her about the Garzas. She listened, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said. "A small one, but a start." "It's something," Brian agreed. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to ask. "Jane, I've been thinking. You're new here. You have a business to run. Getting involved in this? It's a risk. A big one. Why are you so willing to put everything on the line to help me?" Jane stopped petting Thor, her hand resting on the dog's head. She looked away, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the office window. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, freighted with a history he couldn't have imagined. "Because I've seen this story before," she began. "I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. Not a big one, but it was beautiful. My family had been there for 3 generations. It was our whole world." She described a life much like the one Hank had lived, one tied to the seasons and the land. Then she described the arrival of a massive agribusiness conglomerate, a company much like Agricorp. They built a huge factory farm just upstream from her family's property. Within 2 years, our well was contaminated with runoff. Our cows started getting sick. Their milk production dropped. My father, he was a proud man, a fighter. He tried to take them on. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting facts from a textbook. "He spent every penny we had on lawyers. We took out a second mortgage. The company's lawyers drowned him in paperwork, in delays, in appeals. They bled him dry, legally and financially. We lost the farm in a foreclosure auction in 2017. Agrigen, the company, bought it for a fraction of what it was worth." She finally looked at Brian, and for the first time, he saw the deep, unresolved pain in her eyes. "My father had a heart attack 2 months later. The doctor said it was his health. But I know they killed him. They took his land, they took his pride, and it broke his heart." The silence in the small office was absolute. Brian felt the weight of her story settle over him, a grief so profound it was almost a physical presence. He understood now. This wasn't just a matter of professional ethics for her. This was personal. This was a ghost she had been living with for years. The wall that Brian had so carefully constructed around his own pain began to crumble. He had never spoken of the war, not really. He had never shared the burden of the things he had seen, the friends he had lost. But looking at Jane, at this fellow survivor of a different, quieter war, he felt a sudden, overwhelming need to connect. "I was a medic," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "In the Army. My last tour was in Afghanistan. There was an attack on a village near our base." He swallowed hard, the memories thick in his throat. "I was the first one on the scene. There were so many people hurt. I did everything I could, but there was this one little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She reminded me of my niece." He stopped, his voice failing him. He didn't need to finish the story. The raw pain in his eyes said everything. "I couldn't save her. I just couldn't." He hadn't said those words aloud to anyone, ever. Jane didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it wasn't his fault. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, her touch a silent acknowledgement of his pain. In that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just a veteran and a veterinarian. They were 2 people, scarred by different battles, who recognized the same wounds in each other. They had found in one another not just an ally, but the deep, unspoken empathy of a fellow survivor. And in the quiet of the late-night clinic, a true alliance was forged. The alliance forged in the quiet of Jane's clinic needed a battlefield. They found it in Brian's kitchen, the old wooden table, scarred with the history of the farm families who had come before, was now covered with topographical maps of the area. It had become their war room, the nerve center for their small, desperate insurgency. The soldier in Brian was now fully in command, but it was a different kind of soldier. The impulsive head-on approach that had led to his first failure was gone, replaced by the patient, meticulous strategist he had been trained to be. He pointed to a spot on the map, a dense cluster of cottonwood trees about 200 yards from the AgriCorp fence line. "This is our primary observation post," he said, his voice low and steady. "It offers the best cover and a clear line of sight to the discharge pipe. Mateo, you said their security patrols use the main service road. That means this area should be clear." Mateo Garza, his face grim, nodded. "They drive the fence line twice a night, once around 10, once around 3 in the morning, like clockwork. They never get out of the truck unless they see something." "Good. Predictability is a weakness we can exploit," Brian said. "We'll set up in 2-person teams, 8-hour shifts. We watch, we document, we do not engage. Our only goal is to get conclusive, legally admissible evidence." Jane, leaning over the map, tapped a pencil on the image of the pipe's location. "Conclusive means we need high-resolution photos or video. We need to see a license plate, a company logo on a truck, a clear face, anything that definitively links the dumping to AgriCorp or one of its contractors." "That's the hard part," Elena Garza added, her arms crossed. "They do everything in the dark for a reason." Their resources were meager, a collection of repurposed tools from their separate lives. Mateo brought 2 motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use to track deer. Jane contributed a high-end digital camera from her clinic, equipped with a powerful telephoto lens she used for documenting injuries on large animals from a safe distance. Brian supplied the rest: 2 pairs of military-grade binoculars, thermal blankets to mask their heat signature, and the discipline to use them effectively. Their first 2 nights on watch were a lesson in patience and the biting cold of the Nebraska plains. They saw nothing but the indifferent stars and the occasional sweep of the security truck's headlights. It was boring, uncomfortable, and disheartening work. Brian took the first watch each night, insisting on being the one to establish the post's security. He would lie for hours in the damp, cold dirt, the world shrunk to the circular view through his binoculars, with Thor lying motionless beside him. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of their mission. At the farm, he was slowly returning to his old self, but out here in the darkness, he was a different animal. He remained utterly silent, his body a tense coil of potential energy. He was a sentinel, his senses extending far beyond Brian's, a living early warning system. The breakthrough came on the 3rd night. The air was cold and still, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. Brian and Mateo were on watch, huddled behind the crumbling remains of an old stone wall that marked the original property line. It was past midnight, deep into the dead hours of the night, when the world fell to sleep. Brian was scanning the fence line for the 100th time, the monotonous view of wire and posts starting to blur. Beside him, Thor, who had been as still as the stones they hid behind, suddenly lifted his head. His ears, 2 dark triangles in the gloom, pivoted sharply to the north. A low rumble, a vibration more felt than heard, started deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but a signal of pure alert. Brian froze, his hand immediately going to Thor's back in a silent command to stay. "What is it, buddy?" he whispered. He raised his binoculars, scanning the direction of Thor's intense gaze. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the whisper of the wind. Yet Thor remained rigid, his entire being focused on a threat he alone could perceive. Brian trusted the dog more than he trusted his own eyes. He adjusted the focus on the binoculars, his heart starting a low, heavy drum against his ribs. 2 minutes passed. Then he saw it. A flicker of light, so faint it was almost imaginary. Headlights, but they were barely on, casting only a dim, ghostly glow. A vehicle was moving slowly, cautiously, along a dirt service road inside the AgriCorp property, a road that wasn't on any of their maps. It was a large vehicle, its shape a hulking black silhouette against the slightly less black horizon. "Mateo," Brian whispered, his voice tight. "Camera." Mateo, who had also seen the lights, was already moving, raising Jane's camera. The vehicle came to a stop, its engine idling softly, in the exact area where Brian had discovered the hidden pipe. It was a tanker truck, its long, cylindrical body a dark, menacing shape in the night. It was completely unmarked. No logo, no company name, nothing. Two figures, little more than dark smudges, got out of the cab. One stood watch while the other unspooled a thick hose from the side of the truck and dragged it into the darkness of the shrubs. Brian's hands were rock steady as he brought the camera from Mateo, who was a better spotter. The lens was powerful, but the darkness was a formidable enemy. The camera's autofocus struggled, hunting in the low light. He switched to manual, his fingers deftly adjusting the focus ring, relying on skills he hadn't used in years. Click. The sound of the shutter was impossibly loud in the silence. Click, click. He took shot after shot. The images on the small screen were grainy and indistinct. The distance was too great, the light too poor. He couldn't make out a license plate, which seemed to be intentionally caked in mud. The faces of the two figures were obscured by shadows and pulled-down caps. It was frustratingly, maddeningly imperfect. But it was proof. It was a picture of a ghost, blurry and fleeting, but it was a picture nonetheless. After 10 minutes, the hose was reeled in. The figures got back in the cab, and the truck rolled away as silently as it had arrived, its dim lights vanishing into the vast darkness of the corporate land. An hour later, the four of them were gathered around the small screen of Jane's laptop in Brian's kitchen. The smell of stale coffee hung in the air. On the screen were the best of the photos Brian had taken. They were blurry, filled with digital noise, and frustratingly vague. "You can't read the plate," Mateo said, his voice laced with disappointment. "And you can't identify the men," Elena added softly. Jane zoomed in on the truck itself. "It's a standard tanker, but it's completely anonymous. Legally, this is weak, circumstantial." A heavy silence fell over the room. They had risked so much for these grainy, inconclusive images. But as Brian looked at the faces of his small team, he didn't see defeat. He saw something else. He saw the same quiet, burning resolve he felt in his own chest. "It's weak," Brian said, finally breaking the silence. "But it's not nothing." He looked at each of them in turn. "Before tonight, we had a suspicion. We had a theory. Now we have a fact. We know they are doing it. We know when they are doing it, and we know how. This," he tapped the screen, pointing to the blurry image of the ghost-like truck. "This is the first piece. Now we just have to find the rest." The weak evidence didn't break their spirit. It cemented it. The enemy was no longer an invisible force. It had a shape, a schedule. The quiet in the darkness was over. The hunt had begun. The grainy photographs on Brian's laptop did not create the immediate explosion they had hoped for. Instead, they triggered a slow, creeping retaliation, a series of invisible tripwires designed to isolate and break them. The first wire snapped 3 days after their night watch. Brian received a call from the loan officer at the bank in Promise Creek. His application for the farm loan, which had been moving along smoothly, was now on indefinite hold. The officer cited a sudden, vague concern about regional agricultural instability. It was a polite corporate way of saying someone had made a phone call. The next day, a frantic Elena Garza called. Their main supplier for a specific, drought-resistant seed variety had abruptly canceled their order, claiming a supply chain issue. Mateo had called every other supplier within 100 miles. None could help them. It was a targeted attack, a quiet effort to choke their livelihoods. Agricorp wasn't using bombs and bullets. It was using spreadsheets and phone calls. The pressure was mounting, a silent, crushing weight. The message turned from a quiet threat to a loud, unmistakable warning on a cool Thursday morning. Brian went to the barn to plan his day, Thor trotting happily at his heels. He stopped dead in the doorway. The heavy wooden door, which he always secured with a thick iron bolt, was splintered near the lock, hanging crookedly on its hinges. It had been forced open. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He motioned for Thor to stay, the dog instantly sensing the shift in his demeanor, a low growl starting in his chest. Brian stepped inside. The interior of the barn was dim, shafts of dusty light cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with the foul, chemical stench of petroleum. His modest winter supply of grain, 20 sacks he had bought with the last of his savings, had been destroyed. Every single bag was slashed open, the golden grain spilling out across the dirt floor. A dark, viscous liquid had been poured over the pile, soaking into it, contaminating it beyond salvation. Motor oil. It was an act of calculated cruelty, designed not just for financial damage, but to send a message of utter violation. They could get to him. They could touch his things. They could ruin his future. This was no longer about pressure. This was violence. Brian stood there for a long time, his fists clenched, the cold fury from Jane's clinic returning, harder and sharper this time. He did what any law-abiding citizen would do. He called the sheriff. An hour later, a squad car rolled up the driveway. The man who stepped out was Sheriff Brody, a man in his 50s whose uniform was stretched taut over a prominent belly. He moved with a lazy, deliberate slowness, his eyes holding a look of deep-seated indifference. He was the kind of man who had worn the same groove into his office chair for 20 years. He ambled into the barn, looked at the ruined grain, and made a tisking sound. "Well, that's a shame," he said, his voice flat. He took out a small notepad and a pen. "Any idea who might have done this?" "I have a pretty good idea it was someone from AgriCorp," Brian said, his voice level, controlled. Sheriff Brody stopped writing and looked up, his expression shifting from boredom to annoyance. "Now, son, let's not go throwing around wild accusations. AgriCorp is the biggest employer in this county. Why would they care about your little bit of grain?" "Because I've been asking questions about the creek that runs through my property, the one they're using as a private sewer." The sheriff sighed, closing his notepad. "Look, I'll ask around, but what this looks like to me is kids, or maybe a drifter passing through. Malicious mischief. Happens all the time." He turned to leave, his duty clearly done in his own mind. "My advice to you, Mr. Bryan, is to mind your own business. Don't go stirring up trouble where there isn't any. It can make life complicated for folks." The message was as clear as the motor oil on his grain. The law was not on his side. He was alone. That night, the farmhouse felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a forward operating base in hostile territory. The sabotage had changed the rules of engagement. They had breached his perimeter. He knew from his training what came next. After a show of force against property, the next target was personnel. He thought of Jane, of Mateo and Elena and their little girl. He thought of Thor, sleeping at the foot of his bed, a picture of trusting innocence. The quiet, simmering fury inside him solidified into a hard, cold decision. He stood up and walked into his bedroom. In the corner stood a tall, steel gun cabinet. He unlocked it, the click of the lock echoing in the silent house. He reached in and pulled out the Mossberg 500. It was heavy and cold in his hands, the blued steel and worn wooden stock a familiar, comforting weight. It was a tool, nothing more, nothing less. He carried it to the kitchen table and sat down, placing it in front of him. From the cabinet, he retrieved a box of shells. He opened the flap. Inside, nestled in neat rows, were the heavy, brass-ended red shells of 12-gauge, double-aught buckshot, lethal rounds designed to stop a threat permanently. He picked one up, its weight solid in his palm, and as his fingers closed around it, the quiet kitchen dissolved. The smell of coffee was replaced by the acrid, metallic stench of cordite and hot metal. The gentle hum of the refrigerator became the deafening roar of automatic fire, the screams of men. He was back there, in the dust and the heat, the weight of his body armor pressing down on him, the rifle in his hands feeling like an extension of his own body. He saw the face of a young man, barely a teenager, his eyes wide with fear as he raised a weapon. Brian's hand flew open, the red shell clattering onto the table. He was breathing heavily, a cold sweat on his forehead. His hands were shaking. That was the man he had been, a person trained to react to a threat with immediate, overwhelming, and lethal force. A destroyer. He had come here, to this farm, to bury that man, to leave him behind in the dirt of a foreign country. Was he about to resurrect him now, to protect this new life? His gaze fell on Thor, who had lifted his head and was watching him, his amber eyes filled with a quiet, knowing concern. The dog was the embodiment of the peace he was trying to protect. If he used those red shells, if he became that man again, he would be destroying the very peace he was fighting for. With a deep, shuddering breath, Brian's shaking stopped. His resolve hardened. He pushed the box of buckshot away. He reached back into the gun cabinet, past the lethal ammunition, and pulled out a smaller, plain cardboard box. The label, printed in simple black letters, read, "Flexible Batten Rounds." He opened it. The beanbag rounds looked different. They were translucent, the small fabric pouch of lead shot visible inside. They were a tool of control, not of termination. With a steady, deliberate motion, he picked up the first non-lethal round and slid it into the shotgun's loading port. He picked up another, and another, until the magazine tube was full. He gripped the pump's forearm and, with a powerful, decisive motion, slid it back and forward. The shuck-shuck of the action was a sound of finality. The weapon was loaded. It was ready. He leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the shotgun's cool receiver. The choice had been made. A war had come to his door, but he would fight it on his own terms. He would meet violence with strength, but not with lethal intent. He would not become the destroyer to save his sanctuary. He would be its protector. The grainy photograph on the laptop screen felt like a ghost. It was proof of a haunting, but it could not convict the haunter. In the tense quiet of Brian's kitchen, the four allies stared at the image, the frustration of fifth, unwelcome guest at the table. "It's not enough," Jane said, her voice cutting through the silence. She had been saying it for an hour, in different ways, but its truth had not softened. "It proves a truck was there. It doesn't prove who owned the truck, what was in it, or what they were doing. A good lawyer would call it a coincidence, a delivery truck that made a wrong turn." "It's poison, Jane, we know it is," Mateo Garza countered, his voice tight with anger. "Knowing it and proving it in a federal court are two different universes," Jane replied, her expression grim. "To win, we need the poison itself. We need a sample taken directly from that pipe, collected in a way that preserves the chain of custody. We need a sample of the soil it's been leaking into. We need the golden proof, the kind of irrefutable evidence that no lawyer can explain away." A heavy silence descended. The implication of her words was clear. Someone had to go back. Someone had to cross the fence, expose themselves to the enemy, and retrieve that proof. The four of them looked at each other. Jane was a doctor. Mateo and Elena were farmers. There was only one person in the room with the training for such a mission. Brian felt their gazes fall on him. He nodded slowly, accepting the unspoken nomination. "I'll do it," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stood and walked to the map on the wall, his mind already shifting from defense to offense. He began to lay out the plan, the soldier taking over, his words clipped and precise. He detailed the entry point, a blind spot between two of the security cameras Mateo had identified. He outlined the 10-minute window he would have between the security patrols. He explained the risks of noise, of thermal detection, of leaving tracks. But as he spoke, a cold, heavy feeling began to settle in his gut. This was different from any mission he had ever run. There was no backup. There was no medevac chopper on standby. There was no command structure to report to. It was just him, a fence, and the darkness. And the weight of what would happen if he failed felt immense. It wasn't just his own safety on the line. It was the hope of the Garzas, the fight for Jane's past, the very future of this small, fragile alliance. He looked at their faces, full of trust, and for the first time since this fight began, he felt a deep, unnerving flicker of hesitation. The burden of command was a lonely one. He must have shown it on his face because a raspy voice cut through his tactical briefing. "Got a minute, son?" Brian turned. Hank was standing in the open kitchen doorway, a bag of what smelled like freshly baked bread in his hand. He had heard about the barn and had come to check on him. The old man's tired eyes took in the scene, the maps, the tense faces, and seemed to understand everything in an instant. Brian nodded and followed him out onto the porch. The evening air was cool. "You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," Hank said, his voice gentle. He gestured for Brian to sit on the steps. "Something like that," Brian admitted, running a hand through his hair. Hank sat down beside him with a groan, his old joints protesting. "You think you're the first one to have to fight for this dirt you're sitting on, don't you?" Brian didn't answer. "Let me tell you a story," Hank said, his gaze fixed on the distant fields, now bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. "Back in 1934, we had the Great Drought, the Dust Bowl. The sky was brown for a year. The corn turned to powder in the fields. The creeks ran dry. This one, too," he nodded towards the west. "Nothing but a bed of cracked mud." He described a time of absolute despair, far worse than what they were facing now. The banks were foreclosing, families were packing up their meager belongings and heading west, broken. It seemed like the end of the world. "My grandfather was here then," Hank continued, his voice taking on a distant, reverent tone. "And so were the Garza's great-grandparents and the Millers, all of them. They were about to lose everything, but they were stubborn. They found out the Platte River, 10 miles south of here, still had a trickle of water in it, so they decided they were going to bring the river to the farms." He paused, letting the impossible idea hang in the air. "They got every able-bodied man and woman from a dozen farms. They had nothing but shovels, picks, and a couple of old mules. And they started digging. They dug from sunup to sundown, day after day, for an entire summer. A 10-mile ditch by hand." He described the hardship, the blisters, the hunger, the moments of doubt when they wanted to give up. He spoke of how the women organized the food and water, how the children carried away the dirt in buckets. It was a battle of sheer will against nature itself. "They finished it," Hank said, a note of quiet pride in his voice. "Just before the last of the crops died. That ditch brought enough water to save them. It saved this whole community. It's all gone now, filled in by time. But the legacy of it, that's still here." He turned to look at Brian, his eyes clear and sharp. "This land isn't just dirt and crops, son. It's soaked in the sweat and the struggle of the folks who came before us. They fought for it. They bled for it. Agricorp, they think they can buy the dirt, but they can't buy the history. They can't buy the bones of our ancestors. That's what you're really fighting for." The old man's words landed like a depth charge in Brian's soul, shattering his hesitation. His personal fight, his quest for peace, suddenly felt small. Hank had given him something profound. A connection. A legacy. He wasn't just a lone soldier fighting for his property. He was the temporary guardian of his ancestors' promise. His resolve hardened into something unbreakable. He stood up and looked at Hank. "Thank you," he said. The two words were all that were needed. The infiltration happened just after 2 in the morning. Brian left Thor with Mateo at the observation post with a specific instruction. If the security truck deviated from its path or lingered too long, Mateo was to move 200 yards away and create a noise. Thor, on cue, would erupt in a volley of barks, a perfect diversion to draw attention away from the fence. Clad in dark clothing, Brian moved like a shadow. He cut the chain-link fence with muffled snips of a bolt cutter, peeling it back just enough to slip through. He moved low and fast, every sense on high alert. The story Hank told was a silent chant in his mind. He reached the pipe. Working under the dim red light of a small headlamp, he opened the sterile collection kit Jane had prepared. His movements were swift and economical. He took a sample of the oily liquid in a sealed vial. He used a small trowel to collect a core sample of the dark, contaminated soil, placing it in a separate evidence bag. He labeled each with the date and time. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. He was just slipping back through the fence when he heard the distant rumble of the security truck's engine. A moment later, from far to his left, Thor's powerful bark cut through the night, sharp and urgent. The truck's headlights swiveled in that direction. The diversion was working. By the time the truck passed his position, Brian was gone, the fence carefully wired back into place, leaving no visible trace of his passage. Back in the farmhouse kitchen, the mood was electric. Brian placed the 2 perfectly sealed and labeled samples on the table. They were the golden proof. Jane was ready. She had spent the night compiling a complete legal dossier, a detailed report on Thor's medical case with the blood analysis, a signed testimony from Mateo and Elena about their crop failures and their daughter's illness, the grainy photographs of the tanker truck, and a professionally written scathing cover letter addressed to the Environmental Protection Agency's Regional Enforcement Division. They worked together, adding Brian's signed testimony about his discovery of the pipe and the collection of the samples. They packaged everything into a thick courier envelope. Jane sealed it with a strip of evidence tape. She held it up. It was more than just a complaint. It was a declaration of war. "It's sent by overnight courier," she said. "They'll have it by 10 in the morning." They had done it. They had gathered their weapons and fired the first real shot. Now all they could do was prepare for the storm that was sure to follow. The delivery of the dossier to the EPA was like throwing a rock into a calm pond. The ripples began slowly, almost imperceptibly, before growing into crashing waves. First, a federal investigator from the EPA's regional office made a discreet visit to Promise Creek, conducting quiet interviews and taking soil samples near the pipe. Then rumors started swirling through the small town about AgriCorp executives holding emergency meetings. The silence of fear that had gripped the farmers for so long began to crack, replaced by a cautious whisper of hope. But AgriCorp was not a company that yielded easily. Their response was swift, brutal, and personal. The day after the EPA investigator left, a hand-delivered letter arrived at Brian's farmhouse, a thick legal document from AgriCorp's lawyers. It was a cease and desist order accusing him of trespassing, corporate espionage, and defamation. It threatened him with a lawsuit that would undoubtedly strip him of everything he owned. It was a clear attempt to intimidate him, to drown him in legal threats before he could make any more waves. Then came the call to Jane. Thompson, the local manager of AgriCorp, a man whose face was as slick as his suit, called her clinic directly. He offered her a generous donation to the clinic's equipment fund, contingent on her withdrawing her testimony and ceasing all involvement with Brian. When she refused, the tone shifted. He hinted at investigations into her veterinary licenses, reviews of her clinic's hygiene, and rumors spread about her professional competence. He was attempting to destroy her credibility, her livelihood. The threats, though insidious, only strengthened their resolve. They were working, they were hitting AgriCorp where it hurt. But Brian knew that a cornered animal was the most dangerous. Thompson wouldn't stop at veiled threats. The next move would be physical. "They're going to try to shut me up," Brian told Jane and the Garzas in his kitchen, his tone grim. "The lawsuit is a distraction. They'll try to neutralize me before this goes public." Mateo clenched his jaw. "What are you going to do?" Brian tapped the Mossberg 500, which now sat loaded with beanbag rounds next to his bed. "I'll be ready." The days that followed were a tense waiting game. Brian remained hyper-vigilant, his senses sharpened, his past training fully engaged. Thor was his shadow, his instincts perfectly attuned to Brian's heightened state. The dog never strayed far, his ears constantly swiveling, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He knew. It happened 3 nights later as Brian was driving home from Jane's clinic. He had been there late, helping her review some complex legal jargon in the cease and desist letter. The darkness on the gravel road was absolute, the kind of inky blackness that swallows headlights. The old Ford's beams cut a narrow tunnel through it. Thor was asleep in the passenger seat, his breathing deep and even. Brian glanced at him, a flicker of peace in his heart. Then it happened. Just as he was approaching a dense copse of trees, a place where the road curved and visibility was limited, Thor's head snapped up. His eyes, in the sudden glare of an approaching car's headlights, were wide and alert. A low, guttural growl, full of menace, rumbled in his chest, rising quickly to a sharp, insistent bark. "What is it, buddy?" Brian murmured, his hand going to the shotgun he kept stowed under the seat. He didn't have time for an answer. The approaching car, an old dark sedan, swerved violently, cutting off the road ahead. It didn't stop. Instead, its headlights blinding him, it forced Brian's truck off the gravel road and into the soft, muddy ditch. The old Ford lurched. Brian wrestled with the wheel. The tires spun uselessly in the mud. He slammed on the brakes. The truck shuddered to a halt, tilted precariously. Before he could react, two figures emerged from the sedan. They were large men, dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by ski masks. They moved with a brutal, practiced efficiency. One headed straight for the driver's side, carrying what looked like a heavy metal pipe. The other moved to the passenger side, pulling a long, wicked-looking hunting knife from his belt. Brian's mind was a torrent of sensory input, 1,000 calculations in a single second. The ditch had bought him precious time. The truck was stuck, but it also offered a barrier. He reached for the Mossberg. "Stay, Thor!" he commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through the dog's frantic barking. The man with the pipe reached his door, grabbing the handle. Brian had just enough time to brace himself. He kicked the door open with all his strength, slamming it into the man's chest. The attacker grunted, stumbling back. In that same fluid motion, Brian brought the Mossberg up. The first attacker recovered quickly, swinging the pipe. Brian ducked, the pipe whistling inches over his head. He didn't hesitate. He pumped the shotgun, the familiar shuck-shuck, a symphony of controlled violence. He aimed low at the man's thigh and squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening explosion in the silent night. The beanbag round struck the man with a sickening thud. He screamed, a raw animal sound of pure agony, and collapsed to the ground, clutching his leg, writhing in pain. The non-lethal round had done its job. It hadn't killed him, but it had certainly incapacitated him. The second attacker, who had been trying to open Thor's door, froze. He stared at his fallen comrade, then at Brian, who now held the smoking shotgun pointed steadily at him. The man's eyes, visible through the holes in his ski mask, held a flash of shock, then pure terror. This wasn't some defenseless farmer. This was something else. This was a man who knew how to use a weapon. He made a split-second decision. He dropped the knife, turned, and sprinted back to the sedan. He jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and the car screeched away, leaving his partner bleeding and screaming in the ditch. Brian watched him go, the Mossberg still aimed, until the headlights vanished into the darkness. Then, slowly, he lowered the weapon. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving him trembling. He jumped out of the truck, moving quickly to the fallen attacker. The man was still on the ground, whimpering, his leg undoubtedly broken. Brian frisked him, found nothing but a wallet containing a driver's license, and quickly called 911. He gave his location and a brief factual account of what had happened, omitting the suspicions about AgriCorp for now. The sheriff would be there soon enough. As he waited, he checked on Thor, who had finally quieted. The dog nudged his hand, a silent question in his eyes. "I'm okay, buddy," Brian murmured, stroking his fur. "We're okay." By the time the ambulance arrived to take the injured man away, followed by Sheriff Brody and his single deputy, the night was almost over. Brian recounted the events again, his voice flat. Brody, seeing the obvious injury and the discarded metal pipe, couldn't dismiss it as malicious mischief this time. An investigation would have to be opened, however reluctantly. Hours later, the sun was just beginning to paint the sky when Brian finally got his truck out of the ditch and drove back to his farm. The first thing he did was call Jane. "They tried to jump me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm okay. Thor's okay. One of them got a beanbag round to the leg." Jane was silent for a moment. "I'm coming over," she said, her voice firm. She arrived a half-hour later, her small medical bag in hand. She efficiently cleaned the scrapes and bruises on Brian's arm, a souvenir from the fight. As she worked, there was a comfortable silence between them, filled only by the soft click of her tools. "You know, for someone who avoids violence, you're pretty good with a shotgun," she remarked, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. Brian gave a grim, tired smile. Old habits die hard. He looked at her, his gaze holding a deep gratitude. "Thank you for coming, Jane." She met his gaze, her hand pausing on his arm. "Of course. We're in this together, Brian, remember?" It wasn't just a statement. It was a reaffirmation of their bond, forged in shared trauma and common purpose. In that quiet moment, with the first light of dawn filtering through the kitchen window, they acknowledged the profound trust and unspoken care that had grown between them. Later that night, Brian was alone in his bed, Thor asleep on his rug. The farm was quiet. Too quiet. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by an unsettling tremor that ran through him. He closed his eyes, hoping for sleep. Instead, the images came, not of the ambush on the road, but of a different fight, a different night. The blinding flashes of muzzle fire, the shouts in a foreign tongue, the smell of burning flesh and dust. He saw the face of the little girl again, her eyes wide with fear, her tiny hand reaching out. He saw the blood. He heard his own desperate, useless cries for help. He awoke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was back in Afghanistan. The attack had dragged him back, forced him to relive the very nightmares he had come to Promise Creek to escape. The old wounds, the ones he thought he had buried deep, were raw and bleeding again. The new scars on his arm were physical, but the old ones in his soul were far deeper, far more painful. The war had followed him home, just as he had feared, and this time it was personal. The day of the town meeting dawned gray and overcast, the sky a heavy, oppressive lid over the Nebraska plains. The weather was a perfect match for the mood in Promise Creek. Anxious energy crackled through the town, a mixture of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope. This was their one shot, their last stand. In his farmhouse, Brian moved with a quiet, deliberate calm. The nightmares of the previous night had not broken him. They had forged his resolve into something harder than steel. He looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, at the dark circles under his eyes and the fresh, angry scrapes on his arm, which he had put into a simple sling as Jane had instructed. He wasn't just fighting for his farm now. He was fighting for the memory of a little girl in a dusty village, for the proud farmer in Wisconsin, for every person who had ever been crushed by a faceless, powerful enemy. Thor seemed to understand. The dog stayed close, a silent, warm presence at Brian's side, his amber eyes watching his every move. He was a living anchor, keeping Brian grounded in the present, a reminder of what was truly at stake. The Promise Creek Community Hall was a relic from another time, a long wooden building with a dusty floor and the faint, lingering smell of decades of potluck dinners. But tonight, it was a courtroom, a battlefield. The room was packed, every folding chair occupied. The farmers and their families sat on one side, a sea of worried faces and worn denim. They huddled together, drawing strength from each other's presence. On the other side sat the enemy. At their head was Thompson, the local manager for AgriCorp. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that seemed to repel the dust of the old hall. His hair was perfectly styled, his smile was polished and confident, and his cold, assessing eyes swept over the crowd as if he were calculating the value of livestock. He was flanked by two sharp young lawyers from the city, their expensive briefcases resting at their feet. They radiated an aura of untouchable corporate power. The meeting began with Thompson taking the floor. He was smooth, charming, and utterly dismissive. He spoke of AgriCorp's commitment to the community, of the jobs they provided, of the taxes they paid. He painted Brian as a troubled newcomer, a veteran with a grudge, looking for someone to blame for his own failures. He called the poisoning of his dog a tragic but unsubstantiated event, and the claims of water contamination irresponsible rumors. His lawyers followed, speaking in a language of veiled threats. They talked about the legal consequences of defamation, of slander, of interfering with legitimate business operations. They were professional and ruthless, and their words had a chilling effect on the room. The fragile hope that had filled the hall began to wither. The farmers slumped in their chairs, the old familiar fear returning to their eyes. Then it was Brian's turn. He walked slowly to the front of the room, his arm in the sling a silent accusation. Thor, who had been lying quietly at Jane's feet, sat up, his gaze fixed on Brian. Brian didn't look at Thompson or his lawyers. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. He didn't begin with evidence. He began with their pain. "I haven't been here long," he started, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "But I know what this land means to you. I've heard it in Hank's stories about his grandfather. I've seen it in the tired lines on Mateo and Elena's faces as they fight to save their home for their daughter." He spoke of the dead livestock, the failing crops, the strange illnesses. He gave a voice to the quiet despair that had haunted Promise Creek for years. He wasn't presenting a case. He was telling their story. "Agricorp tells you this is just bad luck," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But it's not bad luck when it only happens to the people who stand in their way. That's not bad luck. That's a strategy." Then he turned to the evidence. Jane, operating a small projector, flashed the grainy photo of the unmarked tanker truck onto a makeshift screen. It was blurry, yes, but it was a ghost made visible. Brian then held up the two sealed and labeled evidence bags containing the soil and water samples. "This is the poison they have been feeding into your land, into your water," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "This is the truth they have been trying to bury." Thompson's lawyer shot to his feet, a condescending smirk on his face. "Objection! This is a farce. An amateur show and tell with illegally obtained, utterly inadmissible—" He never finished his sentence. The main doors at the back of the hall swung open with a loud bang. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway were two groups of people. The first was a man and two women, all wearing official blue jackets with the bold yellow letters EPA printed on the back. They were calm, professional, and radiated federal authority. Behind them stood a woman in her 30s with a sharp, intelligent face and a reporter's notepad in her hand, followed by a man with a large professional news camera resting on his shoulder. The woman was Sarah Jenkins, a well-known investigative journalist from the state's largest newspaper, the one Jane had contacted. A stunned silence fell over the room. Thompson's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. The lead EPA agent, a tall, no-nonsense man, walked to the front of the room. He addressed the crowd, but his eyes were locked on Thompson. "We are agents from the Environmental Protection Agency's Regional Enforcement Division," he announced, his voice clear and authoritative. "We are acting on a formal, detailed, and credible complaint filed several weeks ago regarding potential violations of the Clean Water Act by the Agricorp Corporation at this location." He held up a thick manila envelope. "The evidence submitted, including certified lab results from the samples just shown, is sufficient to warrant a full federal investigation, effective immediately." He then turned directly to Thompson and served him with a thick legal document. "Mr. Thompson, this is a warrant to search your premises and a notice to preserve all documents. Any attempt to interfere will be considered a federal crime." The journalist, Sarah Jenkins, was already moving through the crowd, her voice a clear counterpoint to the agents. "Mr. Thompson, can you comment on the allegations that Agricorp has been systematically poisoning local farmland to devalue it?" The camera's red recording light was on, capturing the moment Thompson's carefully constructed world collapsed. His face, once so confident, was now pale, his eyes darting around for an escape. His lawyers were huddled together, whispering furiously into their phones. Sheriff Brody, who had been leaning against the back wall, suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. The power in the room had shifted, completely and irrevocably. The farmers, who had been staring in disbelief, slowly began to sit up straighter. A murmur went through the crowd, then a smattering of applause, which grew until the old hall was filled with a wave of cathartic, triumphant sound. Brian stepped back from the podium, the adrenaline leaving him feeling lightheaded. Jane was beside him, her hand on his good arm, her eyes shining with tears of relief. Thor nudged his leg, a silent, happy gesture. Brian looked out at the scene. The EPA agents calmly doing their work, the journalist interviewing a weeping Elena Garza, and a stunned but beaming Hank, the corporate villains in disarray. AgriCorp's scheme had been built in the shadows, protected by money and fear, but it couldn't survive the light. Justice, it turned out, hadn't needed a miraculous rescue. It had just needed a few brave people to drag the truth out of the darkness and into the unforgiving glare of a camera lens and the rule of law. The seasons turned. The harsh, revealing light of late summer gave way to the crisp, golden melancholy of autumn. The town meeting was not an end, but a beginning. It was the moment a long, festering wound was lanced, allowing the slow, painful, but necessary process of healing to begin. The legal battle against AgriCorp was a grinding, complex affair that would likely clog the federal courts for years. But the first decisive victory already belonged to the people of Promise Creek. Thompson, the slick corporate manager, was gone, fired by AgriCorp in a transparent attempt to distance themselves from the scandal. He and the two men who had attacked Brian were facing a host of federal charges, their futures looking as barren as the land they had poisoned. Empowered by the EPA's investigation and represented by a pro bono environmental law firm Jane had found, the farmers of Promise Creek, with the Garzas as lead plaintiffs, had filed a class action lawsuit that made headlines across the state. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, it was a fair one. The real change, however, was not in the headlines or the courtrooms. It was in the air of Promise Creek itself. The oppressive blanket of fear had lifted. Neighbors who had once been too scared to make eye contact now stopped to talk on the road. The town hall, once the site of a tense showdown, now hosted weekly community potlucks. People shared equipment, offered help with harvests, and looked out for one another with a renewed sense of solidarity. Hank, who had been so full of weary resignation, now had a permanent twinkle in his tired eyes. He had started telling his stories again, not as eulogies for a dying way of life, but as lessons in resilience for a community that had remembered how to fight. One Saturday in October, a group of volunteers gathered by the creek that ran through Brian's property. The EPA had overseen the removal of several tons of contaminated soil, leaving a raw, ugly scar on the land. But today was a day of reclamation. Jane had organized a community planting using funds from an environmental grant. Brian worked alongside Hank and the Garzas, digging holes and planting young cottonwood and willow saplings along the creek bank. The work was hard, but a spirit of joyful collaboration filled the air. He watched as Elena's young daughter, healthy and bright-eyed, chased a butterfly, her laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. It was the sound of a future that had almost been stolen. Jane came and stood beside him, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge of mud on her cheek. She looked out at the scene, at the small, determined group of people working together to heal a wound in the earth. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "when I first came here, I was just running away. I thought if I could find a quiet place, I could forget what happened to my father, to my family's farm." She looked at Brian, a deep, grateful warmth in her eyes. "You taught me that you can't run from the past, but you can stand up and make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Thank you." Brian looked at this remarkable woman, his ally, his friend. "We did it together," he said. And it was true. They had found in each other a shared strength, a partnership forged in the fires of a quiet war. That night the house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the empty, waiting silence he had once craved. It was a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the satisfaction of a day's hard work and the promise of a better tomorrow. He walked into his bedroom and opened the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed. From it, he took out his folded army duffel bag. He unzipped it and reached inside, past the carefully preserved uniforms, and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was of a young man with a wide, easy grin, his arms slung around Brian's shoulders. Sergeant David Miller, his best friend, lost to an IED outside of Kandahar in 2013. For years, looking at this photo had brought a fresh wave of guilt, the sharp, metallic taste of failure, of not being fast enough, of not being able to save him. He sat on the edge of his bed, the photo in his hands. He thought of the little girl in the village, the memory that had haunted his nightmares. He had carried their ghosts with him, a crushing weight of loss and helplessness. But tonight, as he looked at David's smiling face, the familiar guilt was gone. It was replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He couldn't save David. He couldn't save the little girl. He couldn't undo the past. But he had saved the Garza's farm. He had helped save Hank's home. He had saved this small piece of the world from being broken. He hadn't run from the ghosts. He had finally given them a resting place by honoring their memory, by protecting the living. He carefully placed the photo on his bedside table, out of the bag and into the light for the first time in years. The next afternoon was perfect. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows and bathing the rust-colored fields in a soft, golden light. Brian walked through his pasture, the dry grass crunching under his boots. A few yards ahead of him, Thor was a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. Fully recovered, his coat thick and glossy, he bounded through the tall grass, his powerful body a blur of graceful energy. He leaped into the air to snap at a grasshopper, his ears flopped back, his amber eyes alight with the simple, perfect happiness of being alive. Brian stopped walking and just watched him. He watched his friend, his anchor, his partner in a war they had won. He looked out over the rolling hills, at the distant lights of his neighbors' farms beginning to twinkle on in the twilight. He heard the whisper of the wind through the corn, the same sound that had greeted him on his first day. He had come here seeking peace. He had thought peace was the absence of conflict, an empty silence where the echoes of war could finally fade. He had been wrong. The silence he had sought was the silence of a graveyard, the quiet of a life without purpose. The truest peace he now understood was not the absence of a fight. It was the quiet contentment that came after a fight worth winning. It was the steady, calm strength in the heart of a protector who had kept his promise. It was the feeling of standing on solid ground, with a loyal friend at your side, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that you were finally home. It's often said that we rescue animals, but sometimes they are the ones who truly rescue us. They give us a reason to fight for something more than just ourselves, and they ask for nothing in return but our loyalty. The bond between a veteran and his dog is a special kind of promise, a story of healing written in quiet moments and brave deeds. If these tales of courage and devotion touch your heart, we would be honored if you would join our community by subscribing and sharing your own thoughts below. Our next story is already waiting for you. Just click on the video now, appearing on your screen to continue the journey with us.